Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Frank Carrol. I'm a veteran of the Forest Service for many years. I was in Boise for 10 years, back when these big fires first started, and I have a presentation I'd like to make. It's a USB. Yep. For the last 12 years, I've been a wildfire consultant and an expert witness in various cases across the country, and then also helping people understand wildfire impacts and fire ecology, wildfire forensics, how we fight fire, and what the result of that is. And so I want to tell you a little story that's pretty shocking. It's less shocking now than it was when we started. How do I advance the slide here?
Yeah, you can just go left.
There, just so. Okay, so my company is Professional Forest Management, Wildfire Pros. I want to talk about inverse condemnation by wildfire, and I think it's fascinating that we have this body of photography now across the country that includes any element that you want, really. This is not AI, this is a photograph. And so I don't know what he's talking about, but he's talking to somebody. There's a new Forest Service here now. When I was a hotshot squad boss on the Santa Fe National Forest hotshot crew, we didn't have any of this stuff. These guys, they remind me of when my grandfather's pictures being on the border, the Mexican border in 1914, riding against Pancho Villa. And here's these lads, they're having a great time. They're armed with bandoliers full of ignition devices and pistols to shoot them. I don't see any hand tools, but they've got their fire shelters and they've got their stuff. And I want to talk about what this means. There's a young woman who spent time on a hotshot crew, and then she's become a fairly successful writer named Amanda Monthai. And in 2020, both in Science magazine and almost simultaneously in Atlantic magazine, she had this article. And it was titled, Land Managers Can't Burn the West Fast Enough. And the premise was prescribed burns, which can create buffers against large fires, can only do so much. In other words, I think you all know that for all the talk and discussion about prescribed fire, the Forest Service doesn't have the staff to do the EISs and to do the comply with the substantive and laws that relate to that. And so they'd like to do a lot of prescribed fire in the shoulder seasons when it's cool in the fall and cool in the spring, but they can't. And so they want to do that. And so these, what they've done is they've turned to wildfire as their principal management tool. And that's not an opinion, that's just the way, that's just what they've done. And they've had to do it for some reasons. I don't know if they're good ones, but I'll tell you about it. These huge wildfires that we're seeing in many cases are premeditated. They're not by accident, they're not a result of not enough firefighters, they're not a result of any other independent factors. They're not a result of climate change, although the climate, I'm not arguing about the climate's variable. They're a result of purposeful activity. We call these hotshot crews now the asphalt hotshots because they like to stand on the road and shoot fire. And I'm not here to attack firefighters, I am a firefighter. And what Amanda said is if the location is right, if extreme weather's not predicted, if the appropriate resources are on hand, if the skies are blue, if all is well, if we're not hungry, it'll go perfectly and it'll be awesome. And none of those conditions, I submit, are ever present. What we've seen for since 2017 is the Forest Service lighting, what they call firing operations now. They no longer call them burnouts and backfires. Now they call them firing operations. They're lighting these fire operations at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with red flag winds. In a case on the Roosevelt fire in Wyoming in 2018, an operation like that, by the midnight sun, hotshots burned 54 homes, the most expensive of which was $3 million. near Jackson Hole. And so what they're doing is, the chief puts out a letter to the troops, chief of the Forest Service, Randy Moore, puts out a letter to the troops every summer in the spring, and he says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use unplanned fire to reintroduce fire to fire-depleted ecosystems. By unplanned fire, there's no nuance there. It's not naturally caused fire. It's not human-caused fire. As I'll show you, a military aircraft dropping flares in a very important defensive maneuver, start a fire. They used that one. I'll show you how that worked. What I like about this slide, though, all these pictures, by the way, are pictures taken by firefighters and posted on Instagram. You can do pound West Fire, and you can see a bunch of pictures of what's happening right now in Arizona on the Mogollon Rim, or your old fires here, lava and so on. To reintroduce fire to fire-depleted ecosystems, what do you notice about that picture? And I'll tell you, it's saguaro cacti that are 400 years old, many of them. And saguaro cactus, the forest plan on the Tonto National Forest prohibits anyone from destroying or modifying the Upper Sonoran Desert, or the Lower Sonoran Desert in this case, by damaging any of those cacti. You can go to jail for shooting a saguaro in that part of the world. There's a scenic byway right here where this firing is happening dedicated to the saguaros and Arizona cypress. And yet the fire team decided to take this action and go light all these hot spots around these cacti. There are miles of dead cactus. These firing operations in this particular fire were 40 miles long, up and down 2 major highways. I'll show you that. And they have support for this. This is the International Association for Wildland Fire, and these are credible people, and they're saying that fire is good. I agree with that. Fire in many conditions is good. Ponderosa pine forest and lodgepole pine forest depend on fire. But the way we're doing it now, I'll show you, is I don't think what we had in mind. This is a little fire that I've been following in Arizona on the Mogollon Rim, which is the breaks from the high country on the Coconino near Flagstaff that falls off into the deserts into Phoenix and Tucson and so on. And a little fire started called the West Fire. And at this point, it started out as an acre and just squirreled around like many of you have seen. Wasn't any problem to anybody. And at this point, they were estimating that it was 10 acres. And somebody asked the question earlier, I think it was Dar, about smoke jumpers. What happened to smoke jumpers? They just disbanded the Gila smoke jumper base. Smoke jumpers in the early days, after World War II and all the way through the 70s into the 80s, jumped sometimes 2 jumps a day, sometimes 6 or 7 a week. I wanted to tell you this statistic here to tell you about what happened to rapid initial attack with smoke jumpers. It costs, right now, it costs about $35,000 a season to train a smoke jumper. These smoke jumpers are averaging 4 jumps a season. Why is that? Smoke jumpers are designed for rapid initial attack to put fires out. What if your agency policy is not to put fires out, but to let them be reintroduced to fire-depleted ecosystems? Then you no longer need smoke jumpers, you won't call them, and you won't use them. And that's exactly what's happening. I wanted to, this is the West Fire I was talking about, and what I wanted to see here is that it started out as this little, it was a little fire back here that operated in a typical way in the Southwest, predominant southwest wind. It started back here on the tail of that little kidney bean shaped deal and kind of ran up to the northeast, and they caught it. But they didn't catch it very hard, and they decided, you know what, we're going to use this thing, and we're going to burn a bunch of this country up. And you know, maybe that's a good idea. I don't know. I don't think it's a good idea at the time of year that they did. But what I want you to see is that we no longer have to depend on federal press releases about what they're doing or what they say they're doing in public meetings. We can now follow in real time each one of those red dots with a bright white in the middle is coming from 3 or 4 different satellite sources. And so these are 6 hours old. And so if you want to know what the agencies are doing with a specific fire, you can go to Pound Fire Mappers in your URL, and there you are. You can watch it. And so, normal fires don't start, from the southwest to the northeast and then curl themselves around in a long, thin deal, right? And hook back around. What they did is what we call big box and burn. They're using fire to safely and effectively extinguish fire when needed. And I submit to you, that is not about safely and effectively extinguishing fire. That's about a natural resource objective. Manage our natural resources. In this case, they're managing them with fire. The last active management thing that the Forest Service can do without anybody's permission is to use emergency fire suppression appropriated congressional dollars to manage the land. Everything else is a lawsuit, is a mess for them, but they can use fire at will. And as a nation to live with fire. So the Forest Service has unilaterally decided that we should all live with fire. But they didn't ask us about that. They didn't come out. You remember the big public meeting where they had all you folks come in and testify about what you thought about that, and then you had an objection period, and you were able to object and tried to change things. You don't remember that, do you? Because it didn't happen. And so, in fact, these guys are putting the Ukrainians to shame. These drones are about $45,000 or $50,000 a piece. They're getting bigger and bigger. They have dispensers on them. They carry 450 of what we call dragon eggs. They're incendiary devices, ping pong balls we call them. When they go through that little chute, they load up the bin, and when the ball drops out of the little chute, it is injected with glycol, and when it hits the ground, it bursts into flame in 45 seconds. And so now firefighters don't even have to put themselves in harm's way to go out and start fire. What they can do instead is use the drones to surround the fire and then to burn the center of it. This fire on the right is the same fire on the left as it was getting near its conclusion. And by the way, just a mile outside of that southwestern perimeter is the town of Pine and Strawberry. If the wind would have picked up, we would have had another bunch of communities, another bunch of tragedies burned to the ground. The 2020 bushfire was one of the most alarming fires that I was aware of at the time because of the magnitude of what happened. And down in the lower left there in the southwest corner, the fire started at a little recreation area. And it was burning pretty good in the wind, and it burned that little green space, and it was burning across the desert. Air tankers were well able to control it, and they kept it on this side of the highway on this side, and they kept it out of the creek on this side, out of the river. And suddenly we were seeing burning 30 miles from the north tip to the southeast tip, and about 22 miles maybe on the northwest tip. Everything that you see in brown there was lit on purpose to reintroduce fire to fire-depleted ecosystems. This country is covered with 400-year-old cactus. So the next year, there was another fire in the same area called the Telegraph Fire. And it was another typical southwestern fire. It started in the southwestern wind, blowing it pretty good, and it started down in the corner near Superior, Arizona, and it ran up towards Miami and Globe, two communities there, and then it stopped. And if you look at the kind of dark orange there on the 6th, the 8th and 9th of June that year, the fire stopped along that road. They stopped it at that road. Suddenly on the 11th, the forest supervisor ordered the troops the IC ordered the troops with the consent of the forest supervisor to go up on top of the mountain, that's the highest point around there, Pinal Peak, and light it on fire. Now, he told us the reasons he did it, but they didn't make a lick of sense to anybody. When people, early in the morning, people looked up there and starting to smoke among the radio towers. He was protecting the radio towers. But the problem was they couldn't get the fire to burn because the vegetation was too green. And so he decided, in order to really protect Pinal Mountain and reintroduce fire to fire-depleted ecosystems and so on, that he would come down into Six Shooter Canyon in the bottom of East Mountain and light that on fire. And he did. And it blew up 36,000 acres that day. It wiped out cattle. It put his own forces in chaos. It burned multiple little ranches and homesteads and so on, burned people out. A unilateral decision about reintroducing fire that nobody got to say anything about. And by the time he was finished, the actual fire should have been the green. That should have been the fire footprint. By the time he was finished, it was this entire mess on the right as well. They burned 85,000 acres of this desert environment on purpose. And this is not a conspiracy theory. This is their map. We were standing there watching this and going to the briefings day after day. So when you think about that, that's a pretty astonishing thing. That's federal fire policy on the part of the Forest Service. That's not climate change. And it turned out that one of his major objectives that was never stated publicly was he wanted to run the telegraph fire into the Mescal fire. The Mescal fire was what they called dormant at this point. That same slide where I showed you the 8th and 9th of June where the telegraph fire stopped, the Mescal fire was dead. But he decided he wanted to run the telegraph fire into the Mescal fire, and he did. So they dragged it across there and burned it into that country. And on April, I think it was April the 21st, maybe wrong on that date, of 2018, they sat all the ranchers and permittees down in that area, and they told them that they were going to be really excited because they were happy to announce that they were going to be burning every federal acre in Gila and Pinal counties for the good of the system, for the health of their grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So firefighters lit the mountain on fire from the canyon floor. This is more and more common. It's easy to get to. And an even more difficult thing for us to get our heads around, is that they're lighting these fires again and again, over and over, day after day, even in quiet sectors of the fire where there's nothing to do. Private property owners were not consulted, just like folks here on the lava fire and so on were not consulted. But private property owners, in my experience, have an opinion. Representative Boyle's little meeting last night in Weiser had 70 mad, sad, angry people there. And what'd they have, 6 hours of notice? It was overwhelming. The agency is now investing in high technology, and it's amazing tech. These are what they call Type 1 drones. These drones are not fire drones. These are intelligence drones. And the operators sit in their little trailer, literally in this little trailer in the heat and smoke and everything. And even at night, they plan and they implement burn plans. Drones you can fly at night. They're not helicopters, there's no people on board. And so they've gotten really good at the technology of lighting stuff on fire. This is a ridge operation seen through infrared one night. The story I want to tell you here that's horrifying to me and the one that haunts me every summer, this was 2020. It was called the North Complex in California. And on the upper right is the town of Quincy, which is famous for the Quincy Library Group, where a bunch of people sat down together and tried to do forest policy and had some success. And on the far lower left is the big lake at Oroville, California. And in between, I want you to think about that green, all that whole green piece right there. It's 194,000 acres, and it burned in maybe 6 hours. It burned 194,000 acres. It killed 16 people in their beds, trying to get out their doors, in their cars, trying to escape, on their motorcycles, trying to leave their garages. And it started out as one of these declared situations where they're going to kind of mess with it a little bit. The Claremont fire was on the upper right and the Bear fire on the left. And they decided to burn them together on the north north side of the Middle Fork of the Feather River Canyon. And just a little ways down, down the canyon from there is where the Paradise Fire, where Paradise burned down in the Camp Fire, 85 dead, 1,900 homes burned. And so they started lighting it. And I guess they did a pretty good job. They got a fire going in between the two fires. And it expanded, started to pop out on them here and there, but wasn't creating too many issues at this point. And on the 8th of September, September 8th, the Forest Service at the time claimed that the fire jumped, left the fire edge on the south side of the fire and ran across the canyon, but that's not what happened. What happened was, they built dozer lines, heavy dozer lines across the other side of the canyon, Feather River Canyon, and they lit those lines on fire. And that made sense from a tactical perspective. You light that on fire and push it off across into the main fire, and maybe you've, done some good. So it bumped out on the 8th. And on the 9th, it did massive devastation. Some of the most beautiful old growth forests in California burned in this fire. And it was burned in firing operations. And it's been 4 years now, and we're still working with people to understand that this was not a climate change act of God. This was a federal fire policy. And it's important because a tort, wrongful death was committed. Criminal negligence may have been committed. So the Bear Fire, which was the little one on the left, killed everything, said Dave Daly. Daly was a professor at the University of California and a rancher for 5 generations. And they lost almost 400 cows. And he and his sons and grandsons, granddaughters, everybody, rode out through the forested range, their permitted lands and their private lands, and they had to shoot anything that was not absolutely dead already. The loss of private equipment, private property, log decks, millions and millions of dollars in logging equipment, heavy equipment, people's livelihoods, people's homes were burned. And one of the sad things about this policy to me is that the government has the authority to burn you out, but they don't have the authority to compensate you for the loss. That's a really important point. If the federal government has a policy that allows them to unilaterally let these fires burn and then burn your community and burn your house, that have a policy in the Article 5 of the Constitution that allows you to be compensated for the inverse condemnation of your property for public purposes. When they're lighting these fires, they're declaring that there's a positive public purpose to do that, and therefore they're going to do it, and they do it. Now that you're burned down, they should also declare that they're going to compensate you for that, just like they would if they bulldozed your house to build a freeway. Does that make sense? And so wildfire use and managed fire, there's no legal basis now. In May of this year, there was a legal basis for these policies. Now there's not. The Supreme Court overturned the Chevron deference. Probably the most important legal thing that's happened for natural resource management since 1984. The Supreme Court didn't just overturn a piece of it, they threw the whole thing out. And the Forest Service's entire program was based on the Chevron deference. Their opinion was good enough to take these actions. So there was no programmatic EISs, no planning rule, no substantive laws like clean air, clean water, ARPA, T&E species. I wonder how many T&E species went down. Hundreds of miles of riparian areas. And sensitive, core habitat for owls, all kinds of stuff. And so fire managers, all up to this point at least, and still today, because the lawsuits are running slowly, but fire managers are using emergency fire suppression money, which is appropriated by Congress, to do what amount to these massive, summertime, expensive, prescribed wildfires, and they have no authorization to do that from Congress. One of your counties has passed an ordinance that involves the Organic Act. Really worth looking at that piece of paper because it took on new meaning. So public and private landowners are often unaware of the policy until after the fire. This little family had a great little ranch, and they were doing all kinds of good stuff and raising organic food and having guests and so on. And the day after the fire, they were standing there in the ashes wondering what they're going to do now. It's a common experience in the West. These are proprietary decisions, meaning the Forest Service can have a policy, a government agency can have a policy. And if it's vaguely related to congressional intent, it's okay for them to have a policy. But when firefighters make a decision to light something on fire, it becomes a proprietary action on behalf of an individual. And the Supreme Court in 1957 in the Sierra Pacific versus United States case specifically said that that public firemen are excluded from the Chevron deference when they're fighting fire. Why? Because when these people take these actions, the burden is so great on individual landowners and so on that the Supreme Court said that the government should participate in that. If there's going to be these huge fires and all these damages, then the government should help fix it. Even Governor Newsom came out 2 years ago and he said, man, this let burn policy is reckless. And by the way, you're going to hear from the Forest Service every time they speak, there is no let burn policy. But to all of us who are not part of that organization, it's a let burn policy. If you don't attack the fire and it's headed for Mark's logging equipment and, it's starting to burn stuff down and you aren't fighting it, that's letting it burn. That's what the governor said. The Dixie Fire, which is one of the most detailed studies that we have from Zeke Lunder, I gave a reference there at the bottom, was a 1 million acre fire. It was one of the first 1 million acre fires in the country. There were two. The August Complex was a little bit bigger, but the Dixie Fire was really well studied. And Lunder's estimated that 600,000 acres of that 1 million acre Dixie Fire were lit day after day by firefighters doing whatever they were doing until they had this massive fire. Then media reported it as, oh my gosh, climate change is just blowing these fires. We've never seen fires like this. These are the hugest fires in history. When one of the folks in here talked about human factors being part of the problem for these fires, that person was right, the IC, the state IC. But the state IC didn't tell you, I was disappointed. He didn't tell you that he was lighting a lot of that human-caused fire. Why didn't he mention that? Here's the before and after pictures on the Dixie Fire of a little community there in California. One day it was a smoke-filled community, little rustic houses, and I guess Trump headquarters or something. And the next day it was a desert. Astonishing. Somebody else mentioned how astonishing this destruction is in these things. So we have this, in my mind, an out-of-control agency. And I'm trying to be kind about this. I love the Forest Service. I was in the Forest Service for 30 years. But I don't recognize what's happening now. They're using emergency fire suppression money to field thousands of firefighters to do unprescribed wildfires for 8 months through the spring, fall, and summer. When the agencies tell us that the planning level is PL5, there's no more firefighters out there, how about putting the fires out that they're on and bringing them back into the new fires is an idea. So the national strategy that the Forest Service proclaims, the wildfire crisis, the national strategy to address that crisis, is a creature of the Forest Service unilaterally. Wildfire use, which is unanchored in any law. The National Park Service also has a similar policy, but they've done full EISs and public involvement for every park, monument, et cetera. The BLM has very limited use of this authority. The BIA doesn't use it at all, neither do the states and private property owners, to my knowledge. And you heard that from your own people today. One of the outcomes of these massive fires and this fire policy is that these big wildfires are a gift that keeps on giving. And while the 2022 Hermit's Peak fire was still burning, on July 27th, it rained really hard in one of the little watersheds. And they pulled 3 bodies out of this cabin. And we're now exploring all of the ramifications of that. The post-fire effects of these big fires are often almost as bad or worse than the actual fire. There was a bridge across here, a beautiful cabin, little lodge across the creek and so on. in this picture, and when we got to it, the bridge was a tangle of ball of metal downriver, and I don't know how you would address putting this back together. And the big question for a lot of people who get burned out is, why'd this happen to me, and who's going to pay for it? And the government's answer is, God, I'm sorry, I just can't help you, Judy. You know, you're going to have to do a lawsuit. Among other things that happened, 54 bears were killed in the Caldor fire in 2021. And this little bear lived, but there was another little bear who was melted to the tree in a fire this year. These are pictures that I apparently stole from your website. Stunning pictures, sad. I hate how much bears look like people when they're dead. And so this is another problem, both for livestock and for the wildlife. Wildlife can't outrun these fires. People say, oh, the wildlife will run away, or they get in burrows, or, you know, they fly away or whatever. But in 194,000 acres burning in 4 hours, they don't get away. They're dead. The only thing I want to show you on this slide is that that's one of the two of the biggest madrone trees that anybody's ever been aware of in California. Both of them were burned in the August complex in a firing operation that the Midnight Sun hotshots lit over by Ruth, California, and ran 13 miles across the valley and burned these big, beautiful trees up on Cal's ranch. Zeke Lunder is a remarkable guy. He's got a website called The Lookout, Talking Wildfire. And I wanted to bring this to you because it's sad to me. He served in the Forest Service, firefighter, so did I. And what Zeke said earlier this year in his analysis of a burning fire right now was we should not pretend that the Forest Service is a functional agency, because it's not. They can't meet our expectations of them getting anything done because they can't. They lost so much, they're really not functional. They can't do anything at scale, and they haven't been able to since they stopped cutting big trees. They're really good at cutting big trees, but since then, they no longer have a function, meaning active management in general, grazing, et cetera. They've lost their esprit de corps and sense of purpose, and their reason for being has gone away, but they still have to manage the land with active management, right? If the last tool you have in the kit is wildfire, you're going to bend the entire will and $8 billion that your agency has for this purpose to managing natural resources with fire. So they're using fire. I don't want you to nod your heads or anything at this point, but a few days out, I want you to think about that. Why is the Forest Service doing this stuff? And I submit to you that Zeke is right. That fire is the last tool that they have in the toolkit. So there's a bear in the woods, all right, but it isn't Smokey Bear. And I love this slide because this is, to me, this is the opening of every wildfire in history, is the uh-oh squad jumping around, and there we are. And I'll stand for questions, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, are there any questions? I see none. Thank you, Mr. Carrol, for your presentation.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Elizabeth, why don't you